When I arrived back home after my first year of college, I was hoping for some relief, or at least a break from the stress I had been feeling. My life at university had been a whirlwind of new experiences, classes, and people. It felt like I had been running non-stop, and the idea of coming home should have felt like a welcome change. However, when I walked through the front door of my parents' house, the first thing I noticed was the tension. It was thick, almost palpable. The house didn't feel like home anymore. Sure, it was the same house I grew up in, with the same furniture, the same walls, but the atmosphere had shifted. My mother, Laura, was sitting at the kitchen table, papers scattered in front of her, lost in her work. She looked up briefly when I walked in, but her attention quickly returned to the bills she was sorting through. "Hey, honey, how was school?" she asked, her voice distracted. "It was fine, just busy," I replied, trying to sound more upbeat than I felt. I walked past her and into the living room. I knew my mom had been under a lot of stress lately with her job and the financial troubles she and Garrett, my stepdad, had been facing. The business they had invested in wasn't doing well, and it was clear that money was tight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the finances that had changed the dynamic in our house. Garrett, my stepfather, was nowhere to be found. I assumed he was either at work or in his study. I wasn't surprised. Garrett had always been the type to keep to himself. He wasn't cold or distant, but he wasn't exactly warm either. Growing up, I never really felt like he was a true father figure, despite him being in my life for over 10 years. He and my mom had been married for quite a while, but we never formed a close bond. I took a seat on the couch, trying to shake off the discomfort I felt. Everything was different now, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. I had spent my entire first year of college working hard to become more independent, to make my own decisions and live life on my own terms. And now, here I was, back in the same house, feeling like a stranger in my own life. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps coming from the hallway. It was Garrett. He entered the room, looking as calm and composed as ever, though I could tell something was off. He wasn't as distant as usual. There was something new in his demeanor, a quiet tension in the way he stood, like he was trying to figure out what to say. "Hey, Melissa," he said, his voice softer than I remembered. "Welcome home." I looked up at him, surprised by his warmth. "Thanks, Garrett." There was a moment of awkward silence, and I could feel the distance between us, both physically and emotionally. I had no idea what had changed, but it felt like we were both trying to figure out how to reconnect after so much time apart. Garrett had always been a man of few words, but his presence was somehow heavier now, more intense. "How's school?" he asked, taking a step closer. "Good. Busy, but good," I replied, my voice trailing off. I wasn't used to being asked about my life in such a personal way. Garrett had always been polite, but this felt like he actually wanted to know. "That's good to hear." He paused for a moment, glancing down at the floor as if unsure of what to say next. "You've changed. I can tell. You've grown up a lot since the last time I saw you." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. I hadn't expected Garrett to say something like that. I wasn't used to him noticing the changes in me, or anyone really. My mom had been too absorbed in her work, and Garrett, as always, had been distant. "Thanks," I said, a little uncertain. "I guess college does that to you." He nodded slowly, looking at me with an intensity one wasn't used to. I could feel my pulse quicken as he continued to stare at me, but I forced myself to look away. "Well, I'm glad you're home," he said, his voice softer than before. "It's good to have you back." I nodded but didn't say anything. His words felt strange coming from him. They were too personal, too direct. It was like he was trying to make up for all the years of silence between us. But I didn't know how to respond. We had never had this kind of relationship before. We had always been polite, but never close. Now, it seemed like that had changed. "I'm going to take a shower," I said, standing up quickly. I felt the need to escape the weight of the conversation, to give myself some space to breathe. Garrett didn't stop me, though I could tell he was a little surprised by my sudden exit. I made my way to the bathroom, but as I closed the door behind me, I could feel the unease settle in my chest. Something was happening, something that I didn't fully understand. The following days were filled with a quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air, unspoken but ever-present. I tried to distract myself by spending time with my friends, but every time I came back home, there was that same unease. My mother was always busy, either with work or buried in conversations about finances. It wasn't that I didn't understand. She was doing what she had to do, but it still made me feel isolated. And Garrett, well, he had been acting differently. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just adjusting to being back at home, and everything felt off because of that. But as the days passed, his behavior became harder to ignore. Garrett, who had never shown much interest in my life before, started asking more questions. He would ask how my classes were going, whether I was seeing any friends from home, and if I was adjusting okay to being back. Simple, innocent questions, yet there was something in his tone that made me feel like there was more to it. One evening, after dinner, my mom had left for another late meeting with a client. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through my phone, trying to focus on something, anything, to get my mind off everything. And then Garrett walked in. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, standing in the doorway. I looked up at him, a little surprised. "Sure," I said, trying to keep the conversation light. "What's up?" He walked over and sat beside me on the couch. Normally, I would have felt uncomfortable with him sitting so close, but I didn't move. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at the TV. I could feel his presence, though. It was like the air had thickened around us. "How are you really doing?" Garrett asked after a pause. His voice was softer than usual, and I could tell he wasn't just asking about my day. It felt like he wanted to know what was really going on inside my head. I wasn't used to him being so concerned. It was strange. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice a little sharper than I meant. I didn't want to let him get too close, didn't want him to see past the walls I built. Just the usual, I guess. Garrett's gaze shifted to me, his eyes focusing on mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "You know, you don't have to hide everything from me," he said, his tone almost pleading. "If you're having a hard time, you don't have to go through it alone." I shifted uncomfortably. His words seemed genuine, but there was something in his tone that made it feel more personal. "I'm not hiding anything," I muttered, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. There were things I hadn't shared with anyone, and I was starting to realize that I was keeping things from Garrett too. He didn't say anything for a moment. We just sat there, the silence between us heavy, awkward. I could feel his presence next to me, and it made me self-conscious. His leg was too close to mine, and I could feel the heat radiating from his body. It was a subtle thing, but it was enough to make me feel like I was being pulled into a situation I didn't know how to handle. "You know," Garrett said after a while, "I've been thinking about how things used to be. Before all of this." He gestured vaguely toward the rest of the house, as if to include everything about the financial crisis. "Things were simpler. We were more connected. It wasn't always perfect, but we were a family." I swallowed hard. "Yeah," I said softly, unsure of where this conversation was going. "You've changed," he continued, his voice low. "You've grown up. And that's not easy for a parent to watch. But it's nice to see you becoming who you're meant to be. I think you've become even stronger than I realized." His words were kind, but they stung in a way I wasn't prepared for. I wasn't used to hearing this from him, especially not in such a personal way. He wasn't just commenting on how I was doing. It felt like he was commenting on me as a whole, as a person. I didn't know how to respond to that. I didn't know how to respond to him suddenly seeing me in a way I wasn't used to. "Thanks, I guess," I said, trying to brush it off. "But I'm just trying to get through everything." Garrett looked at me for a moment, his eyes still fixed on mine. "I get that. But I want you to know that you're not alone in this. I know it's been hard for all of us, but we're a family. And I'm here for you, no matter what." I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything more. The conversation had gotten too personal too quickly. It felt like we were crossing a line that I wasn't ready to cross. The rest of the evening passed in silence, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of what had been said between us. As I went to bed that night, my mind was racing. Why had Garrett said all that? And why did it feel like something was shifting between us? I couldn't deny it anymore. His presence, his attention, was starting to affect me in ways I didn't understand. And I didn't know if I was ready to deal with it. The next few days were filled with the same quiet tension. It wasn't like anything had changed on the surface, but I couldn't ignore the growing discomfort I felt every time Garrett and I were in the same room together. I tried to keep myself busy, staying out of the house as much as I could, running errands or catching up with old friends. But no matter where I went, when I returned home, the feeling of unease would be waiting for me. Garrett continued to be overly attentive. Whenever I came home, he'd ask how my day went, if I needed help with anything, or if I wanted to talk. And though his questions were always kind, they always seemed to linger just a little too long. His gaze would follow me, and there was always something in his eyes, something that felt different from the way he looked at me when I was younger. It wasn't just his attention that made me feel this way. It was the way he'd casually touch my arm when handing me something, or the way his voice would soften when we spoke. Little things like that, small gestures that normally wouldn't mean much, had started to affect me. I would find myself noticing his proximity, the warmth of his body when we stood too close. I didn't know why it was bothering me so much, but it did. Every time we interacted, I felt this wave of confusion. One evening, I came home to an empty house. My mom had gone to another meeting, and Garrett was nowhere to be found. I was grateful for the quiet. I wanted to relax and not have to think about anything for a while. I made myself some dinner, sat down on the couch, and turned on the TV. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt too quiet, and my mind kept drifting back to Garrett. Then, as I was about to change the channel, I heard the door open. Garrett stepped inside, looking more serious than usual. "Hey," he said, his voice a little deeper than normal. "You're here alone?" "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mom's out again." He nodded, taking a step further into the room. "I thought I might spend some time with you, if that's okay." I didn't know why, but his words made my heart skip a beat. I didn't want to admit it, but the idea of spending time with Garrett, alone, made me nervous. He sat down on the couch beside me, too close for comfort. I shifted uncomfortably, but didn't move away. "What's been going on at school? Anything interesting?" he asked, his voice soft but serious, as though he genuinely wanted to know about my life. "It's been fine. Busy. Just trying to get through everything," I said, feeling a strange tightness in my chest. Garrett nodded but didn't look away. He leaned back on the couch, his body slightly turned toward me. I could feel his gaze, and it made me acutely aware of his presence. I shifted again, pulling my knees to my chest to create some distance. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said the other day," Garrett said, his voice quieter now, "about how things have changed between us. You're right, they have. We used to spend time together, talk more, but now, it's like we've both distanced ourselves." I felt a lump form in my throat. I hadn't expected him to bring this up. "It's just been a weird year," I said, my voice tight. "With everything happening with Mom's work and all, it's been hard." He sighed softly. "I know. It hasn't been easy on anyone. But that's why I want you to know I'm here for you. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." His words were sincere, but they felt like they were crossing a line. I had always known Garrett to be distant, sometimes too distant, but now he was acting like he wanted something more, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. I forced myself to look at him, to acknowledge what he was saying. "I appreciate that, Garrett," I said, my voice a little shaky. "But I don't want to make things awkward." He smiled softly, but there was something in his smile, something that made me feel exposed, vulnerable. "I'm not trying to make things awkward," he said quietly. "I just want to be here for you. You've been through a lot. I know things haven't been perfect, but we're family, Melissa. And family sticks together." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more in his words. That something was shifting between us, and I wasn't sure what to do about it. It was as though I was being pulled into something I didn't understand, and every time Garrett looked at me, every time his voice softened, I found myself drawn in deeper. I stood up suddenly, needing some space. "I'm going to get some fresh air," I said quickly, though I didn't know why I felt so panicked. Garrett didn't try to stop me, but I saw the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He didn't say anything as I grabbed my jacket and walked toward the door, but I could feel his gaze on me the entire time. I stepped outside, hoping the cold air would clear my head. But it didn't. As I walked down the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing control of everything. Garrett's attention, his interest in me, it was starting to feel like something I couldn't ignore anymore. I didn't know what was happening between us, but I could feel the tension growing with each passing day. The days after that evening felt like they were dragging on. My mind kept replaying the conversation I had with Garrett, and I couldn't escape the thoughts that kept resurfacing every time I saw him. I tried to keep myself busy, doing anything I could to avoid being alone with him. But no matter where I went in the house, there he was, always just a room away, always just there. At dinner, he was quieter than usual, almost as if he were giving me space, but the tension between us was thick. I found myself constantly avoiding his gaze. I would catch him looking at me out of the corner of my eye, but as soon as our eyes met, I would quickly look away. Every time, the silence felt heavier. It wasn't like anything had changed on the surface, but something was undeniably different now. The dynamic between us had shifted, and it wasn't something I knew how to fix. That evening, after dinner, I went to my room, needing to escape from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to follow me everywhere. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my thoughts. My mind kept returning to Garrett, his voice, the way he looked at me, the things he'd said. I kept replaying that moment when he had touched my arm and how his touch lingered longer than I ever expected it to. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and that thought terrified me. Why did it bother me so much? Why couldn't I just brush it off like I always had before? There was a knock on my door, and before I could say anything, Garrett stepped into my room. "Hey," he said, his voice tentative. "Can we talk?" I froze. He hadn't asked to talk to me in my room before. It was almost as if he was deliberately crossing a boundary I hadn't expected him to. I didn't answer right away, unsure of what to say. "What did he want to talk about?" "I just want to make sure you're okay," Garrett said, stepping inside and closing the door gently behind him. "We haven't really had a chance to talk since everything." I sat up on my bed, my heart racing. The way he was looking at me, the way he was standing there in my room, it made me feel exposed. "I'm fine," I replied quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Really?" Garrett didn't move, his eyes fixed on me. "I know you're trying to act like everything is fine, but I can tell something's bothering you. I'm not asking you to open up if you're not ready, but I just want you to know I'm here. If you need someone." His words were kind, but they felt too personal, too intimate. It was like he was trying to push past the walls I had built, trying to break down the barriers I had set up to protect myself. I could feel the discomfort growing inside me, but I didn't know how to tell him that this was too much. "I don't know what you want me to say," I said, my voice trembling despite my best effort to sound calm. "I don't want to make things awkward between us." Garrett seemed to hesitate, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at me with those soft eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "I don't want to make things awkward either," he finally said, "but I can't pretend that nothing has changed. I can't pretend that I haven't noticed how much you've grown, how much you've changed." I didn't know what to say. I felt trapped. I had always viewed him as my stepdad, a figure in my life who I never expected to have any deep connection with. And yet here he was, trying to get closer to me in a way that I wasn't prepared for. My emotions were all over the place, and I didn't know how to handle it. "You're my stepdad," I said softly, more to myself than to him. "This isn't supposed to be happening." Garrett stepped closer, and my breath caught in my throat. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's not supposed to be like this, but that doesn't change how I feel. I've never meant for this to happen. But I can't help it, Melissa." His words sent a chill down my spine. I could feel the air between us growing thick with something I couldn't quite name. I wanted to push him away, to tell him that this was wrong, that we couldn't let things go any further. But part of me didn't want to. Part of me wanted to let him in, to allow myself to feel what I was feeling, even if it was terrifying. I stood up from the bed quickly, desperate to put some space between us. "I need to be alone right now," I said, my voice shaky. I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince him or myself, but the truth was, I didn't know what to do anymore. Garrett didn't push. He didn't try to stop me. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "All right. I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable," he said quietly. I didn't respond. I just watched him as he turned and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. I collapsed back onto my bed, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything that would make the overwhelming confusion inside me go away. But nothing made sense anymore. I didn't know who I was supposed to be in this situation. I didn't know what was happening between me and Garrett, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to stop it before it went too far. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But deep down, I knew something had already changed, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The following days were a blur. I went through the motions, eating, studying, pretending that everything was fine, but nothing felt the same anymore. Every time I was in the house with Garrett, it was like an invisible force was pulling me toward him. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it in the way he looked at me, the way his presence filled the room. I kept telling myself that it was all in my head, that nothing had changed. But I knew deep down that I was lying to myself. Garrett didn't bring up our conversation again. He didn't mention anything about what had happened that night, but his behavior remained different. There were small moments, times when our hands brushed as we passed each other in the hallway, when his gaze lingered on me just a little too long, that made my heart race. And every time, I would quickly look away, pretending like I didn't notice, pretending like it didn't affect me. But it did. One evening, my mom had left for another late meeting. I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book, but my mind kept wandering. I couldn't focus. It was like everything around me was just background noise. The only thing I could think about was Garrett, his voice, his touch, the way he made me feel things I shouldn't be feeling. And then, just like that, I heard the familiar sound of the front door opening. My heart skipped a beat. "Hey," Garrett said, stepping into the room. His voice was softer than usual, and there was a certain tension in the air that made my stomach tighten. "Hey," I replied, my voice tight. I couldn't bring myself to look at him directly, so I kept my eyes on the book in my hands. He sat down on the couch beside me, just a little too close. I could feel his presence next to me, feel the warmth radiating from him. The air seemed to get heavier, thicker. "You okay?" Garrett asked, his voice low. "You've been quiet lately." I nodded quickly, though I wasn't entirely sure I was convincing. "Yeah, just been a lot on my mind, you know? School, everything." Garrett didn't seem to buy it. He leaned in slightly, and his eyes locked onto mine. "I know what it's like to feel overwhelmed," he said softly. "But I also know that you don't have to go through it alone. If you need to talk, if you need someone to listen, I'm here." There it was again, his gaze, his words, that softness in his tone. I didn't know what it was about him, but it was like a magnet pulling me closer, making me want to reach out. But I couldn't. I couldn't let myself feel these things. It was wrong. He was my stepdad. But as I looked into his eyes, I could feel the walls I'd built around myself start to crumble. He was so close now, his breath soft against my skin. I wanted to back away, to tell him I needed space, but my body wouldn't respond. "Garrett," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We can't keep doing this." He didn't move. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at me, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. It was like he was struggling with his own emotions too. He wanted to say something, but he was waiting for me to make the next move. "We can't," I repeated, though this time, my voice wasn't as firm. There was doubt in it, and I hated myself for it. Garrett's hand reached out slowly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. The simple touch felt like a spark, like everything between us had been building to this one moment. I felt the heat of his hand, the tenderness in his gesture, and before I could stop myself, I was leaning into him. But just as I was about to close the distance between us, the front door slammed open. My heart jumped into my throat as I quickly pulled away, almost stumbling off the couch. "Melly?" My mom's voice echoed from the hallway. She sounded surprised. "What's going on in here?" I stood up too quickly, panic rising in my chest. My mom appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to explain what had just happened, what was happening between Garrett and me. My heart was racing, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. My mom was standing there, looking between the two of us, and I knew in that moment that everything had just changed. Garrett stood up slowly, his expression unreadable. I saw his jaw tense, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared at my mom, and then he looked at me. I couldn't read him, couldn't figure out what he was thinking. My mom's face was a mixture of confusion and concern. "What's going on?" she asked again, her voice sharper this time. I started, but my words faltered. How could I explain this? How could I tell her what had been happening without sounding insane, without making it worse? "I'm sorry. I think I should go," Garrett said finally, his voice low. He turned to my mom and gave her a small, forced smile. "I'll leave you two to talk." My mom didn't answer. She just watched him leave, and the moment the door clicked shut behind him, she turned to me. "Melissa," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What just happened? Why was he?" Her words trailed off, and I saw the confusion in her eyes. I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I didn't even know what had happened. All I knew was that everything had changed, and there was no going back. The minutes after Garrett left the room felt like hours. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and my hands were trembling as I stood there in the silence, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. My mom was still standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on me with a mixture of confusion, concern, and something else I couldn't quite read. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She just stood there, staring at me as if waiting for me to explain. But I couldn't find the words. What could I say? How could I possibly explain the emotional chaos that had been building between Garrett and me? I couldn't even understand it myself. "Melissa," my mom finally spoke, her voice quieter now, almost uncertain. "What was that?" I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The words I needed to say, the words that would make sense of the situation, just wouldn't form. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't tell her that I had been drawn to Garrett, that I had let my emotions get out of control. I couldn't tell her that he had become someone I couldn't ignore, someone I couldn't stop thinking about. I don't know, Mom," I said, my voice shaky. I looked at her, but I couldn't meet her eyes. My guilt was suffocating. "It's complicated." My mom didn't seem convinced. She stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind her. Her face was pale, and she looked almost lost. Complicated, she repeated, her voice rising slightly. Melissa, why was he acting like that with you? I don't know, I replied quickly, shaking my head. I could feel the tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, and I fought them back. I couldn't cry right now. Not in front of her. It's just, things have changed. With everything going on at home, with the money, with the pressure. I don't know what happened. Mom was silent for a long time, and I could see her struggling to understand. She wasn't angry, at least not yet, but the look in her eyes told me she was confused, maybe even a little hurt. I could see that she was trying to figure out what had just happened, but she wasn't sure if she could trust what I was telling her. Melissa, she said, her voice softer now. I know things have been hard. I know Garrett and I have been distant, but this is something else. You and him, this isn't just about the stress we're all under, is it? I felt the room closing in on me, the weight of her words suffocating me. It was like a part of me wanted to reach out to her, to tell her everything, to explain how this had all spiraled out of control, but I couldn't. I couldn't face the truth. Not yet. I don't know what to say, Mom, I whispered. I never meant for any of this to happen. Mom's face softened slightly, but there was a lingering sadness in her eyes. She stepped closer to me, her hand gently resting on my arm. Melissa, you need to understand that Garrett and I have our own problems. But you can't let things get out of hand like this. You can't let yourself get caught up in something it's not right. I felt her words hit me like a ton of bricks, and suddenly, I couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure if she was talking about Garrett and me, or if she was talking about something deeper, about the way we had all been avoiding the truth, about the way everything had been falling apart. I didn't want this to happen, I whispered, my voice barely audible. But now it's like I can't stop it. My mom didn't answer right away. She just watched me, her eyes searching mine as if trying to find a way to help me make sense of everything. Finally, she spoke again. You need to take a step back, Melissa. From Garrett, from everything. Her words cut through me like a knife. I knew she was right, but I didn't know if I was strong enough to do it. I know, I said, my voice trembling. I will. I promise. But I didn't know if I could keep that promise. I didn't know if I could stop feeling the way I did about Garrett. He had become too important to me, and even though I knew what was happening between us was wrong, I couldn't seem to pull myself away. I couldn't shake the way his touch had felt when he held my arm, or the way his eyes had looked at me when he said he couldn't pretend anymore. His presence was too overwhelming, too intense. And now, with everything exposed, I didn't know where to go from here.